the last video of Generation 4 now, and it's the one that I know everyone's been waiting for, and it is the NeoGeo. This is the myth, the mythical, this is the unicorn console. Everyone seems to know what it is, what it does, what it looks like. Nobody's ever seen one, unless they were very, very rich or very, very lucky. Now, a bit of personal history on this one is that, like I say, everyone, certainly anyone that was into their computer games at my school, everyone knew about this console. There were even certain children, and you know who you are, who claimed to have one. Although, of course, when you finally managed to get round their house one weekend, usually catching them by surprise, you would go to see this amazing Neo Geo and find out that they were sitting there with a black and white TV and a Commodore 64. They were liars. Nobody had these things. Certainly nobody gave it to their children, unless, you're a lunatic. But we all knew this was the arcade machine in a console. This was the arcade in your home. This was the only console that actually managed to do it. From all the ones that claimed to do it, Sega, I'm looking at you. This wasn't a console that was based on arcade hardware. This was literally the arcade hardware stuffed into a box. We all knew this was a 24-bit system. Bearing in mind that everyone knew the Mega Drive was a 16-bit system, everyone knew the Super Nintendo was a 16-bit system. We knew that this was a 24-bit system, although it turns out, in reality, depending on how you measure it, it's either a 16-bit or a 32, but it does depend on how you're measuring that. But this is basically what it was. Now, SNK, this is basically what they decided to do. They thought, well, why compete? Well, I mean, we don't need to get into this sort of market where we compete. It's very much the Rolls-Royce idea. Well, Rolls-Royce don't say, how do we compete with VW? Or how do we compete with Ford? Rolls-Royce say, no, we're Rolls-Royce. We're just going to make a car and we'll charge what we like for it. And people will either buy it or they won't. It's that simple. And SNK did exactly the same thing. They said, well, we've got this arcade stuff, these arcade cabinets, and they were pretty good arcade cabinets. And they basically said to themselves, well, why do we need to get into this competitive market? Who's got the most bits, who's got the most sprites, who's got the most colours, blah, 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 and make a cut-down version of our arcade hardware? Why don't we just release the expensive arcade board as a home console? And the games that were expensive as well to go along with it, and just see what happens. So that's exactly what they did. So the thing is, these things are absolutely amazing. It's amazing that anyone ever bought them at the price they were, because when they came out, I think I literally have no clue, incidentally, what they went for in Britain, because I cannot find any reference to them ever being sold here in an official capacity. So, as far as I'm aware, they did come as a European version, but I can find no record of any shops that ever actually officially sold them in Britain. This is just a thing. I cannot find. There are no high street. For instance, Woolworths didn't sell them. Dixon's didn't sell them. Toys R Us didn't sell them. There are no high street chain shops that ever sold these things in Britain, and I can find no records of anything, any price that they may have gone for, like an RRP or anything like that. So I honestly have no idea. Everyone seemed to know they were around about the £750 mark if you did get to get one. So I'm just going to go by on what was playground wisdom in the 90s. They obviously did have an official release in the States, and they had an official release in Japan. But as for Britain and Europe, I can find no official release. I can't even find a release date for this console in Britain and Europe, even though now that people have these things and have looked at the BIOS chips that are in them, there was very clearly a European version. Although when it came out and how much it was, I've no clue. So that's that. It's difficult to research this thing. So that's the AES machine. And basically there are no real accessories for it. There are the giant controller sticks that are basically, again, they are an arcade controller. They are huge. They're almost the same dimensions as the console itself. And they are full-size arcade sticks. And they were expensive as well. And the other accessory is a memory card, which, as I'm given to understand, because I've never used one and I've never been able to get my hands on one, and they are, again, very expensive. What you could do with this is you could have your high scores and settings and things like that on your home console. And then you could take the memory card either to somebody else's console or to a specially designed slot in some of the NeoGeo arcade machines and have your high scores on the arcade machine. That's basically what they were for. So effectively some sort of like a game save, but not really. So that's it for accessories for this console, for this particular version of the console, I should say. So on to the games, and this is another funny one. They came in massive cartridges, honestly the size and weight of VHS tapes. They were massive cartridges. They dwarfed all the other cartridges on the market for, again, a very simple reason. They were arcade boards in plastic shells with two edge connectors as well. So that tells you the amount of just raw hardware that was in these things. They are very expensive is the other thing. They were very expensive when they came out, the AES cartridges, and they are even more expensive now, to orders of magnitude more expensive now for some of the more collectible games or stuff that got a limited run. The games definitely did come out in the UK, although again, tracking down information on shops that actually sold them is very, very difficult. There were no real licensing deals done. I think they were basically chucked out of computer shops and things like that, because there were no licensing deals done with like say the big names in sort of retailing at the time. So it's very difficult to know who was selling them and for what price. Although everyone seems to agree that they were very, very expensive. Now, the things that I do know about the game library, they are mostly fighting games. There's the odd shooter, the odd platform adventure style game, but they were mostly 2D fighters. They were mostly also made by SNK themselves. There was very few third-party titles on this system. Which again is almost unheard of. It is amazing that this thing actually sold anything. But bearing in mind that the whole idea of the system is to play at home what you were playing in the arcades, and what were popular in the arcades? Fighting games. There's no question of that. That was in the 90s. That was it. That was your arcade games, were fighting games. But the other thing SNK did with their licenses, which shows you how disinterested they were in being part of the whole console competition, was they actually ported their games to other systems. So you can get stuff like World Heroes and things like that on the Super Nintendo. King of Fighters, I think, did King of Fighters come out on the on the Mega Drive. It might come out for the Mega CD or something like that. I seem to remember King of Fighters being on something, but I haven't written it down. Anyway, but they did port their games onto other systems. So, I mean, can you imagine some other company doing that at the time? Can you imagine Nintendo taking Mario Kart and putting it on a Sega cartridge, or Sega taking Sonic or Ristar or something and putting it on a Super Nintendo cartridge? It just wouldn't happen. I mean, it was utterly unthinkable. But this is what happened, and SNK. I mean, I love you, but you're mad. You really are. How this console and these games didn't fail. If you just look at pure sales numbers, then obviously it didn't sell. I think total sales for the consoles are less than 600,000 worldwide. Which for any other console would be a failure. But bearing in mind that there was no real R&D involved. The boards that were in the consoles were already being used in arcades along the world. So there was no real R&D involved. All there really was machine tooling for the plastic cases and things like that. I mean, again, the joysticks were just arcade joysticks. There was no proprietary hardware involved. It was arcade joysticks with a modification of the jammer interface. There was no R&D really involved with these consoles whatsoever. The most expensive part for SNK to actually produce for the home console was the BIOS chips that were inside them, and that was the same instruction BIOS as the arcade, with just extra code making sure it was the home version. So if you take it on the basis that there was no R&D involved in actually bringing this console to market, and there was no marketing budget either. I mean, did you ever see an advert for one of these things? I certainly didn't. So the sales in the region of 600,000 isn't actually that bad now, because it cost them basically nothing to do it. Other than actually getting the console from the factory to the shop, it cost them nothing. This thing was sold by word of mouth wherever it was sold, really. So what else do I want to say about the games? There's no region lock on the cartridges. The only region lock, this is as far as I can fathom, by the way, but the region locking is on the BIOS of the console itself, and this can be modified. There are people that do modifications for the console BIOS. Now, I'm not sure how that's accomplished. I don't know whether it means replacing the chip or whether it can be done as some sort of flash like on a PC. I imagine it's probably replacing the chip, considering that I can't imagine how you would be able to flash a NeoGeo BIOS, but there are people with consoles with modded BIOSes, so that tells me that it can be done. But the point is that any cartridge should work from any region, provided your console has this BIOS mod that will play the game from any region. So there's no region lock on the actual cartridges, that's what I'm saying. So provided you've done this BIOS mod to the console, any cartridge from anywhere should work. And I'll come back to the games in a second, because there's another bit. After I get on to the next bit, you'll see why. Now, because of the expense of the AES console, and because of the expense, certainly now, of the AES games, because these things have ramped up in price in recent years, what a lot of people do now, if they want to play Neo Geo games, is because this console was based on the arcade hardware, what people do is they get the MVS boards. The arcade boards are called MVS. Multi-video system, or I think it's multi-video system, because they came in different variants for the arcades. They had multi-game variants, 4 slots, 6 slots, things like that. So what a lot of people do is they buy these boards that came from the actual arcade machines and they consoleize them themselves. Now this might just be soldering some video wires onto the connections and using jammer connectors for the controllers, or it might be actual mods that make it look and feel like the AES console itself. Now the advantage of this is that the BIOSes are a lot easier to mod as well, because you've got the open board, so you don't. I mean, it's just a case of taking the chip out and putting on another one. The games are far cheaper now. When they first came out, the MVS games were far more expensive, obviously, because they wanted arcade owners to buy them. But as time's gone on, arcades have got rid of, in fact most arcades have gone anyway, and those that hadn't had started to get rid of their Neo-Geo machines by sort of the end of the 90s was when you last saw them in arcades, really. So the arcade games went from being the most expensive ones to really quite cheap, because there are so many of them around. And in fact, if you managed to buy an old arcade machine that was like a 6-game machine, it would probably have 6 cartridges in it. That if you didn't fancy the 6 games that were in it, you could just sell them on. I mean, they are starting to climb a bit now as more and more people are doing this. But that's the advantage of consoleizing the MVS, is that games are going to be far cheaper. The drawback is, of course, that they are designed to be in an arcade. So if you find them complete, they will still just be in a standard brown cardboard box, although they might have the arcade livery and things in the box with them, but very unlikely, as obviously most of this stuff was stuck on the side of the machine over the years, and if you don't have the machine, you're not going to have the stickers and things like that. So that's what people are doing. Also, with the MVS, there are multi-game. There aren't just multi-slot boards. There are actually multi-game cartridges around. So this would be one cartridge that has maybe 3 or 4 games, if you find the official ones. But there are also unofficial ones that have 100, 150 games on the one cartridge. So this makes obviously playing the games far more straightforward. You can buy adapters for your AES machine that let you play MVS games, although again they are reasonably expensive to get hold of, and they're obviously third-party hardware. And for the same the other way around, you can buy adapters to play AES games in your consoleized MVS if you want to. Why you would want to is I don't know, because obviously the AES games are going to be far more expensive anyway, but these things do exist. Because the NeoGeo collectors, and I'm just talking about the people who collect for the cartridge machine, so that's people that collect the arcade carts and people that collect AES carts. These people are absolutely obsessive, mad lunatics with a lot of money, basically. But what it does mean is that, believe it or not, there are still games being made for certainly for the AES and the MVS as well, because they're effectively the same game, just with swapped pins. That's why the adapters exist. Games are actually still being released. Obviously third party, SNK takes nothing to do with it. They're not releasing anything these days, certainly for the NeoGeo machines, but there are games being released, and believe it or not, they are being released on cartridges. There are people, small conglomerates of people, that are using their own money to manufacture these things for new games, and they're not, most of them aren't ports of something that already exists. These are games that are specifically written for this hardware, because there is such a loyal loony fan base that will go out and spend 300 quid, no problem, on a new Neo Geo game, and it doesn't really matter what it is. But the point is, believe it or not, there is still new content being produced for these machines, which, bearing in mind the time these things came out, is absolutely amazing. And again, I'm not talking about stuff that's ported from PC games. This is people coding original games, which is just phenomenal. One thing I should talk about before I go into anything else is the Neo Geo X. This is basically a shit handheld machine that took tiny little cartridges that were multi-game SNK titles, that was produced under a license from SNK themselves, and it was a little handheld machine, not built particularly well. They went for about 150 quid each, and this came in a box with a base station and a cheaper version of the original arcade stick that you then, the base station plugged into your telly, you plugged the handheld into the base station, and you could use the arcade stick to control the games. If you see these, and you can find it for about 20 quid, 25, with all the bits, it might be worth buying. However, SNK gave, I can't remember the name of the company that actually produced it, but it was produced under a license from SNK to use their properties and obviously the likeness and visuals of their properties. When SNK actually got wind of how poor quality these things were, they immediately stripped the company of its license, and that's why you never see them for sale anymore, is because the license was taken back by SNK when they were made aware of the quality of the product that was being released. So despite what you might think about SNK, it does actually care about its consumers and its legacy, at least, if only maybe to look out for it, like I say, its own self-interest. But I think that was a good move, and it's I mean, I don't want to mention the Mega Drive 3 or the Genesis 3 if you prefer, but when I say Mega Drive 3 or Genesis 3, anyone that's ever used one will know exactly what I'm talking about, and that's basically the Sega equivalent of the Neo Geo X. Anyway, apart from that, so after a few years of deciding that they weren't going to compete, suddenly SNK had a change of heart and decided they would compete with Sega and Nintendo, and they released the Neo Geo CD, which was a cut down. It was a cut price model, so it wasn't the exact same stuff as what was in the original Neo Geo hardware, but it did a reasonable job of replicating it. I mean, even so, it was still £400. This did come out in the UK, and it did, as far as I can tell, it was sold in Toys R Us for a time, and it was sold in by, it wasn't Dixon's, who was it? I haven't written down who it was. It was sold in actual retail stores, though, that is the point. The Neo Geo CD, so the consoles were available and the games were available, but it was £400 when it came out. But the good thing about it was the CD games were priced as regular games. It wasn't £350 for a cartridge. It was £40 to £50 for a CD game of that cartridge. Another way they managed to save money was they didn't bundle this console with the arcade sticks. They bundled it with standard control style pads. Although if you did want the arcade sticks, you didn't have to buy the original ones, because they re-released a different style of arcade stick, a cheaper model that you could buy to go along with this console if you really did want the arcade sticks. Although they kept everything backwards compatible, so if you did happen to have an arcade stick from a NeoGeo AES, it would still work on this console, which was good. Nintendo have never thought of that. I don't know why. They change the controller with every generation. But anyway, so again, there's no region lock. So and this one doesn't require BIOS updates. This is no region lock out of the box. So you can technically, provided you can understand the text, again, is always the sticking points with Japanese stuff. Provided you can understand the text, you could buy games from anywhere and it will play on your NeoGeo CD. Although do bear in mind, these are starting to get really expensive as well, because people that obviously, there are the people that can afford the cartridges, and fair play to them. They've got infinite wallet, they can do what they like. There are also people that would like to collect for Neo Geo but can't afford the cartridges, so what do they collect? They collect the CDs. This means they have recently, especially in recent years, they have got rarer and more difficult to find. The Japanese ones are still reasonably cheap if you can find them, but anything that's in English language, forget it. You are going to pay at least what they were worth when they came out, if not more so for some of these CD games. But the good thing is, as I said, there's no region lock on them, so have at it. If you can find something cheap enough, then you can buy it. So, the console itself. Now, there are actually 3 versions of this console. There are 2 Japanese ones and one that went on worldwide release. The first one is the front loader. This is the original Japanese model, and this is the this one's actually quite rare. The most common version of the Neo Geo CD is the top loading version, which was the worldwide model. That was the one that was released everywhere where it was released. Even in Japan they released this model as well, so even in Japan this is the most common model, is the top loader. Now there was a third one released, and it was released in very limited numbers, and what it's called is the Neo Geo CD-Z, which was the last model released, and again in very limited numbers. And what this basically was is it had a high speed CD drive. There's no difference in hardware or anything like that, it's just a faster CD drive. Because obviously, I mean, if you imagine you're taking a Neo Geo game from an AES game, which normally comes on 2 chipboards. So that's 2 edge-connected chipboards that are going to be read almost instantly by a cartridge machine. Now, if you're trying to read the same data from a CD drive, obviously it's going to take a very long time, because it's not plugged directly in. It's got to read the data and then put it through a buffer, send it into the CD memory, and then load it into the main memory, and that all takes an awful lot of time. So much so that even if you were playing like a CD version of not Final Fight, what's the one I'm thinking of? Art of Fighting or something like that, you can expect to wait 20 to 30 seconds for the round to actually start up, and in some of the later games maybe even more. So obviously read speeds were a major issue for this console, and if you don't like waiting for things to load, this probably isn't the console for you. Although this CD-Z that was only released in Japan and in limited numbers is very, very expensive to get hold of, because it basically loads things at double the speed of the original machine. So yeah, I mean, the sticking point with any of these consoles and I'm not even going to talk about the Neo Geo X, because that is definitely an avoid, because it is a piece of shit emulator machine, and that's all it ever will be. It's so that's not even really a console. I just thought it was worth mentioning, because a lot of times when you type Neo Geo into eBay, these are the machines you'll see are these Neo Geo X things. Do not be fooled, they are not the same. People on eBay may be trying to sell them for 150 quid. They are not the same. That is more than they probably paid for them new. So we've written off the Neo Geo X. So what's my verdict on this one? Well, again, it's that question of money getting in the way. Any one of these is going to be expensive. Probably the most expensive system you will ever collect for. It just is, and unless you want a collection of NTSC stadium events. This is going to be the most expensive system that you're going to collect for ever, especially if you go AES. There is no way around it. It is just expensive. So, I mean, definitely don't avoid, again, especially if you like fighting games and arcade style stuff, because you can do no better. This is the arcade console. You cannot do better. The only way you could do better is if you found a Neo Geo arcade machine and put some cartridges in it yourself, which, to be perfectly honest, the way I would do this, if I properly wanted to play Neo Geo games on Neo Geo hardware, the way I would either do it is one of two ways. Either I would find an MVS board and I would either get it consoleized, I would get Unibias put on it, or I would consolize it myself. And then I would go and buy 150 in one cartridge and just keep it constantly slotted in. Alternatively, I would buy an old Neo Geo arcade machine, get it restored back to how it's supposed to be, and do exactly the same. Just buy the 150 in one cartridge for £100 or so and slot it in and keep it in. That's what I personally would do if I wanted to play the original games on the original hardware. But bearing in mind that this is not going to be an avoid, and this is likely not going to be a collect unless you've got infinite pockets. This is probably, I am going to come down on the side of emulate, for the simple reason that the hardware itself is, architecturally speaking, very simple. It's powerful, but it is very simple, and the MAME emulator has been doing a brilliant job of emulating the Neo Geo since pretty much the beginnings of MAME. There is nothing, I can't think of a single Neo Geo title in the whole library that isn't emulated almost perfectly on MAME. So much so that unless you had both versions in front of you at the time, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. Honestly. I would always come down, for just through the amount of expense and hassle you're going to have if you want to collect for this, I would come down on the side of emulate. And that's going to be my final verdict, I'm afraid. No, me personally, I would love to have at the very least the hardware. Even if I had to get 150 in one reproduction game cartridge, I would love to have the hardware for this. I would even really fancy maybe trying out some of these games that are being released, but I don't want to spend 200 quid on a game that I don't know anything about. And don't get me wrong, if I ever find an MVS or even an AES cheap enough, I will definitely pick one up and do that. But life's too short to collect for this console. It depends what you do for a living, obviously. I mean, if you've got the pockets where you can just go on eBay and buy it now, then Why are you sitting here listening to me? Go and do that. But I think definitely for the vast majority of people out there, for 99% of game collectors out there, you're never ever going to collect for this system. Don't even get it into your head that you will ever be able to. Emulate every day of the week. And I hope that hasn't depressed anyone. Because again, I mean, you know, why would you want to go driving around in the Ford when you could have a Rolls Royce? I suppose you'd have a Rolls Royce driven for you, but you know what I'm saying. So that's the end of the NeoGeo video, and that is the end of Generation 4. Obviously, I'm going to do the next video is going to be an introduction to Generation 5 for those of you that don't know what Generation 5 includes. Obviously I know what's supposed to be in Generation 5, but I've sometimes been a bit fast and loose generationally with some of these consoles, and I am aware of that before anyone points it out. It's done deliberately. There's nothing really in any of these videos that's been done by accident. If I've put something into a different generation from what you expect, I've got reason to do it usually. Either that or I'm just being mean-spirited, knocking it down a generation. But anyway, the next video is going to be on Generation 5. It's basically going to be a very quick overview of the generation as a whole. That's probably going to be the last generation I'm going to need to do that for, purely because as we get into sort of 6th, 7th and 8th generation, everything's going to be a lot simpler because there's far less players in the market. People just started to die off console making. It got to the point later on, obviously, where it just wasn't viable for there to be any more competition in the market because the people in it were just so huge. Nobody could try and catch up. So yeah, the next video is going to be an introduction to that, to the 5th generation of consoles, and what I plan to do, what I don't plan to do. So obviously it's sad to see Generation 4 go, because it probably is my favourite. It's certainly the one that didn't introduce me to gaming, but certainly got me far more interested. It was such an interesting generation. Especially when you found out about stuff that didn't come out, you couldn't go and buy in the local shop, and you had to get from another country or something. It seemed so exotic, at the time. It was really good. Anyway, so that's going to be the next video, Generation 5. Sorry to see Generation 4 go, but if you like the video, subscribe. YouTube, Twitter, you know the routine by now. If you've got any comments to make on either this video or the generation of a whole, then please do. Like I keep saying, the comment section is not just useful feedback for me, but it's useful for you, and it might be useful to anyone else listening. Like, if I have got something wrong and you correct it, then hopefully somebody else watching the video will read that comment and go, well, I haven't, and then you might have actually helped somebody without meaning to, which is always a good thing. That's pretty much it. So I'll see you in the next video for an overview of the 5th generation. I know you're looking forward to it, and I will see you then.